You think the question is, give me the evidence. And then someone shows you the evidence, and I'll say, not enough. What else you got for me?
That's exactly how I feel about the resurrection.
If you can't show naturalism's true, shut your mouth.
Shut your mouth.
I'm giving you reasons. Don't sit there and just go, no, that's stupid.
And I think it's stupid. No.
And yet they make fun of anybody who believes in God, miracles, afterlife, the Bible, anything. I'm sorry. If you can't prove your view, this conversation's over.
Fine, then this conversation is over.
Why so angry?
Welcome to Paulogia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. When we last checked in with resurrection scholar Gary Habermas,
Gary Habermas has possibly studied the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus more than anyone who's ever lived.
Now, the world-renowned expert on the resurrection is my friend Dr. Gary Habermas.
He's a professor at Liberty University. He's written over 40 books and over 100 articles, and he is most known for his minimal facts approach.
You are the expert, the number one expert in the world authority on the evidence for the resurrection.
In his endorsement, Mike Licona, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, says there's only one person alive who knows more about the resurrection than Gary, and that's Jesus.
Volume 3 of his 4-volume magnum opus set on the resurrection had just come out, but his press tour had not yet begun.
Dr. Habermas has finished writing all 4 volumes of On the Resurrection. 3 are published, and he's here to talk about it.
We're talking to my friend Dr. Gary Habermas, who is putting together a 4-volume magnum opus set on the resurrection. They're each of roughly 1,000 pages.
It'd be torture to say, okay, I want you to read all 3 of these volumes for our course.
Volumes 1, 2, and 3 have come out. Volume 4 is yet to come.
At that point, only the digital edition was available to me, but the hard copies have since shipped, and I have mine.
The 3 volumes that are out, I weighed them last night, Gary, and they are 13.2 pounds. That's what the 3 of them together. I've got all 3 right here, which is incredible.
Gary's making books that actually double as weights. You can work out with these things.
This came out, what, May?
May 15th.
On the Resurrection, Volume 3, Scholarly Perspectives. 931 pages of text, 968 pages, including the indices.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
I didn't know this till I opened up the book when they sent it to me in the mail. But if you turn it sideways and look at the ends of the pages, you can see the dark lines going up. And those are the section headings in the book.
Now, Volume 3 isn't really a book to be read, any more than one might read a phone book. Instead, it's a reference volume index of resurrection-adjacent topics where Gary lists other books you can go and read.
Again, friends, this is the book we're talking about in this episode, On the Resurrection, Scholarly Perspectives. There's hundreds of quotes and summaries of scholars on all these issues.
Probably one somebody wouldn't read through per se like the others. I read the others through, but it's a resource guide on so many issues.
There's some apologetics in there, but that is like a who's who, or I like to call that volume a critical lay of the land. Where are we at present? What we did was we picked a bunch of topics and we went through them, and all we did was give scholars' views from the far left to the far right, and they're in alphabetical order. And I'm not saying there's never any comebacks. Once in a while, we make brief comments. This is kind of a silly view but for the most part, we make no comments. If I don't like what somebody says about one of the facts, I don't sit there and pick fights with the guy. I just reproduce his view and give you a source.
Gary's most recent interview was while he was on the annual Habermas-Licona joint family vacation.
Every year, let's see, when did you guys start coming?
Either 1996 or 1997 would have been our first year.
Okay. All right, so let's do this. I'm going to start taking some questions. Now, this is the first time I've kind of done this stuff, so I usually have someone helping me with this, but so feel free to, if you're watching, I can see some folks are watching, feel free to submit a question and to Gary.
Now, Mike and Gary did a similar Q&A last year around this time, and I managed to sneak in with the first question.
Hold your questions for right now. We'll let Gary answer this, Paulogia. But then everybody else, hold your questions for right now. We'll get to it.
Which led to a lively exchange.
If you're only going to count appearances to single individuals to get away from groups, I don't think that's fair. And the earliest account...
Well, I think that's fair. I mean, when we talk about answering hallucinations, one of the
Correct.
responses we give, group appearances.
Right.
So isn't it fair? It's fair for someone like Paulogia or someone to say, well, what percentage of scholars today in the field would grant the group appearances?
Which I did a whole video on that you can check out. But this September long weekend, I was out touching grass, as I didn't know this would become an annual thing.
You know, we meet every year. The Habermasses come and visit us, and we'll try to do this every year that they come.
But even though I wasn't there in the chat, I was there living in Gary's mind, in a scandal I'm going to dub Not That Many Critics Gate.
So you were telling me earlier that someone had told you that there are several skeptics out there who are asking or they're really pushing back on you in a specific manner.
In this volume.
Yeah, in this volume.
Yeah.
About, I think it's, you cite, was it close to 6 or over 500 different scholars? More than 500 different scholars. So, but most of those that you have listed in the index are Christians. I think like 350, you said, or about 350 of those 550 are Christians.
I have not counted the index names.
Yeah, you haven't counted the names, Gary. That was me in my last video about you a few months back, called This Resurrection Survey Wasn't What I Expected at All. Gary had been throwing out some irresponsible stats about his book, and I was fact-checking them. One claim was about the percentages of Christians represented in his third volume.
It's a who's who of names across the board, and there are probably more skeptics, yes, agnostics, Christian writers, let's say Jewish New Testament scholars. There are probably more non-Christians than Christians in the book.
Probably more non-Christians than Christians in the book. Now, 558 scholars is a lot of scholars, but it's not so many scholars that I can't go find out the self-proclaimed religions of each for those who have been public about such things. As far as I can determine, based on public record, Gary's got 2 agnostics, 4 ancient Greeks, presumably polytheistic, 12 atheists, 1 Buddhist, 4 deists, 14 Jews, and 1 self-proclaimed skeptic. 78 were unknown, undeclared, or just underdetermined. And that leaves 443 of Gary's scholars who self-identify as Christians. Because Gary didn't specify what kind of Christians he meant, I'm not going to split hairs on denominations. There are Anglicans, Baptists, Catholics, Episcopalians, Evangelicals, Lutherans, Methodists, Presbyterians, and even 3 Mennonites. Shout out to Philip Weeb, Gordon Kaufman, and Vernon Neufeld. And there's Gary himself, of course. Even if all 78 of those unidentified were part of the Church of Satan, that still means 79% of the authors referenced in Gary's book are Christians. 92% of the identified authors are Christians. So no, Gary, there aren't more non-Christians than Christians.
So how many? Oh, I see what you're saying. You mean people who write in this book? Yeah, it's been reported to me so far that there's been 3 different skeptical scholars who have said something like this.
Before we get to Gary's take on my take, indulge me on a tangent for a second. I've got a whole Paulogia versus Gary Habermas playlist that I would like to cite as evidence that Gary is shockingly imprecise about his recollections or retellings of interactions, with video evidence to prove it. At the same time, Gary also has a new policy of avoiding acknowledging me.
Just out of curiosity, who was that critic that you had in mind there? So
I probably would rather not use the name on the air.
It's okay. You can say my name, Gary.
Say my name.
And just in case anybody wonders, it's not a well-known scholar. It's a popularist. Let's say that.
Just give us his initials. That's all we need, Gary.
No, you know who he is.
Gary's got us in suspense now for the rest of the show.
Yeah, maybe he'll reveal it at the end as a bonus. But all right,
off the air.
So there's no way to tell if Gary knows full well he's talking about me, or if we can take him at his word that he's relaying an anonymized secondhand story. Either way, I've graduated from being a popularist to being a skeptical scholar, either in Gary's mind or in the misrepresentation of someone close to Gary telling him about me. Now, Gary has a convenient definition of scholar for who he will address directly and who he will not.
And here's my criterion. We'll interview anybody who is a scholar with a terminal degree, usually means a good doctorate, in a field that is relevant to resurrection studies. So you could have a PhD in philosophy, you could have a PhD in history, you have a PhD in New Testament, PhD in theology, PhD in classics, PhD in archaeology, PhD in comparative religion.
Chipper's minor was comparative religion.
For the record, my Bachelor of Commerce in Computer Science degree and incomplete run towards a Bachelor of Theology do not add up to anything close to these credentials. So Gary will never have to address my minimal witnesses hypothesis directly, and that's fair enough. I can respect a clear methodology. You can't cover everything. But someone who is cited in Gary's book at least 34 times is Dr. Richard Carrier, who recently randomly said this about me.
By the way, I should point out that Paulogia's critique of the Habermas minimal facts argument is the best you're going to find online. So I think everybody should, and he's really full on engaging with Habermas's new book and stuff. So that's some of the best stuff on this so far.
Which was nice to hear. And yet another indication that people who are on Gary's list watch my stuff. Obviously, I can't be certain there wasn't a group of PhD scholars who were independently spending a day poring over the declared faith of over 500 names in Gary's index, but his book came out on May 15th.
This came out what, May?
May 15th.
And my video came out on May 27th, just 12 days later. I doubt anyone with actual credentials was also wasting their time on this. A YouTuber and former pastor called Rabid Atheist did a 3-part series covering my Volume 3 critique.
He keeps attacking Paul as this populist YouTuber and completely ignoring the scholars with PhDs behind him, and I'll throw my master's degree behind him too. It's like you are ignoring the rest of us. You're attacking Paul because you think he's an easy mark. So when Habermas makes this claim that most of them or more of them are skeptics than Christian, he's talking out his ass. Okay, and he should know better. I mean, this is easily fact-checked, and Paul easily fact-checked it, and he's wrong.
And Gary's real-life friend, under the name Real Seeker, was actively in the live chat for those.
They're not facts. He thinks they're facts, but they're not. I absolutely disagree with all of them, pretty much.
So if I had to guess, that's probably where the report originated. And 2 YouTubers evolved through legendary development to 3 skeptical scholars. All right. Let's return back to the main thread.
It's been reported to me so far that there's been 3 different skeptical scholars.
Wrong, and wrong.
Who have said something like this. Habermas says he cites more critics, unbelieving of the resurrection critics, than he cites Christians. But when you go back and look at the names, I guess that's what you're getting at. When you go back and look at the names in the index, it looks like there's way more Christians in the index. Okay, fine. Instead of trying to nail a person on something and then tell everybody, imply the guy's being dishonest or something, why doesn't somebody ask me what I mean?
If that's an invitation to ask you questions, Gary, please email me at paul@paulogia.com. I have many things I'd love to discuss with you in private, rather than have to resort to publicly asking in these videos.
And here's what I meant. When I say I'm citing far more critics than non-critics.
To be clear, Gary didn't say more critics than non-critics. If he did, I wouldn't have been able to do a count. Gary said more Christians than non-Christians.
There are probably more non-Christians than Christians in the book.
And Gary doubled down on this in his recent interview with Frank Turek.
I counted. By the way, I think there's close to 600 different authors in that book. These guys could be, and I counted them by name, and there's more atheists, agnostics, and other kinds of skeptics, or people who could be pretty conservative, but in a different religion. So they could be a conservative Jewish scholar who's not a Christian. So there could be a lot of, again, atheists, agnostics, skeptics, and non-Christian religions.
Again, Gary says there's more atheists, agnostics, skeptics, and non-Christian religions, which sounds to me like doubling down on Christians versus non-Christians. But let's let Gary explain his more recent take.
From what I recall from my own count, about 1/3 of all the people in the book are evangelicals. About 2/3 are not evangelicals. So what I meant was, I have way more people who would not call themselves evangelicals whose critiques apply there. So I might give any simple question and have a list of 10 names. Maybe 7 of them, we do them alphabetically, by the way, maybe a number of them are critics and they go off on us. And maybe 1/3 of them are evangelicals. And so I have the mixture. But overall, I have way more citations for people who would not call themselves, as far as I understand, people who would not call themselves evangelicals.
So it's not that the book references more non-Christians than Christians. It's that, by Gary's measure, the book references more non-evangelicals than evangelicals.
Okay. How are you defining evangelical?
Well, let's use a real general definition. I'm not going to say somebody who believes this definition or that definition about inspiration or that kind of stuff. I'd say evangelicals are people in general who take the Bible seriously. They take the Bible as their guide. They take the Bible as the book out of which we preach. But most of all, I define evangelicals, the Greek word evangelios, and it refers to somebody who preaches the good news of the gospel, which I think is the way, like, for example, Mark says, and he begins his gospel saying when Jesus came forward, he was preaching the gospel. And that's where we get the word evangelical. So there's no doctrinal test for who we call evangelical. It's kind of like saying conservatives and non-conservatives, if that helps. I don't know.
Nope, that helps not at all. Because you've created yourself another entirely non-falsifiable claim by building an entire metric around the no true Scotsman fallacy. You literally just said there's no doctrinal test an outsider can use to check your claim. It's all vibes. And vibes are confused even more by this exchange later in the stream.
People who think, oh, you guys, you think all of you are Christians and all the rest of the world, how many Catholics are you sending to hell? I mean, we got blamed with all kinds of things. We're not the judgmental kind of folks that so many people blame us with, and y'all think we think you got to go to a Baptist church and whatever. We're not like that. We're open. And to say it frankly, but God didn't call either one of us to separate the wheat and the tares. Only God does that. We do not make the choices as to who's a believer and who's not. That's not our job.
Yeah. Well, I'm a Protestant. I believe Catholics are believers, that they're going to heaven. Well, let me qualify that, okay? I believe that there are Protestants that are going to heaven and Protestants that aren't. I believe there are Catholics going to heaven and Catholics who aren't. So it's whether they follow the gospel, right? Just because you're a Catholic or a Protestant or baptized isn't going to make you a Christian.
So according to Gary, I'm to blame for taking him at his word that when he said Christian versus non-Christian, he really meant evangelical versus non-evangelical. But there's also no actual way to define an evangelical versus non-evangelical, and that God himself would never make such a distinction.
What's wrong with me saying, okay, time out. I'm a Christian. They say they're Christians. I'm not going to judge their Christianity. But what you're saying to me is, if worst comes to worst, these aren't devil worshippers. These aren't another religion. These are people who name the name of Christ, who say, I believe Jesus is the Son of God. I won't question their theology. That's not what we're doing here.
This is further muddled by putting vocally self-proclaimed resurrection believers into your non-evangelical camp.
What about non-believers?
Well, I can't describe, I can't vouch for what's in someone's heart or I hate to say someone's a believer, someone's not. I don't want to start being judgmental and say someone's a believer, someone's
Well, if someone like Bart Ehrman comes out and says he doesn't believe Jesus rose from the dead, he's a non-believer.
Correct. Okay. Ed Sanders, I would put Dale Allison in this group. Tom Wright is in this group.
But Dale Allison, I'd say he is a believer.
But he says it a very, he's given credit with them. I know some skeptics who loved Dale Allison because I consider him, and he starts his last book by saying, on page 3, right at the beginning, he says, I'm going to give you my view up front. I think the disciples saw Jesus. Jesus saw the disciples.
I know, but he is not a non-believer.
But he's going to come back against those who say they saw Jesus.
I know, but we're asking for non-believers here. Paulogia is asking for non-believing scholars.
Thank you for shifting the goalposts back to this entirely meaningless and unfalsifiable statistic, Gary. I don't care one little bit of any nuance you may have between who is or is not an evangelical. If you count resurrection-affirming Dale Allison as a skeptic, then your distinctions tell us literally nothing about academic rigor. Stop advertising your book as if it's something that it is not. Somewhere between 79 and 92% of the authors you cite affirm death, deity, and resurrection.
But here's all you need. In order for Christianity to be true, 3 major facts. When you look at all the definitions in the New Testament, mostly in Paul's works and in the book of Acts, here's the 3 teachings: the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And I'll get it down to this level, Frank. If someone said to me, basically all I think that's true in the New Testament can be summarized as evidence for the deity, death, resurrection, and a few other things. Is that good enough for you? Well, I'll tell you what. For me, it's good enough to get you into the kingdom, and you can find out what the answer to those things are. But if the deity, death, resurrection of Jesus are true, Christianity follows. I start my lectures now, and that's how I start.
If affirming death, deity, resurrection is all that it takes for Christianity to be true, then that's also the only distinction that matters if you're going to pretend you have heterogeneous representation. Sadly, when Gary goes on to book promotion tour, the various podcasts are rather unoriginal and wanting to cover basics like why is the resurrection important, what are the minimal facts, and why is swoon theory silly. We've covered those things at length. But if you want to join me in the resurrection weeds, there were a few nuggets of novelty. This viewer question relates to the Jerusalem meetup that is one of the 12 events I reflect upon as part of my minimal witnesses hypothesis. Gary leans heavily on these passages to insist that Peter's resurrection experience and Paul's resurrection experience must have been the same kind of physical body interaction.
So we got another question here from Jay. Is it required that we see Paul seeking information from the other apostles in Galatians? Galatians 2, I guess, when he goes out and talks to Peter, James, and John.
1 and 2.
My understanding is that, that's true, yeah. My understanding is that Paul had the more mature gospel message, emphasizes that he was not influenced by the 12.
He doesn't say that he wasn't. Okay, let me ask you a question. If Paul was not influenced by the 12, why did he go to Jerusalem just 3 years after his conversion and ask Peter and James, the brother of Jesus, to tell him the story of what they saw with the resurrected Jesus? Galatians 2:2. Why did he, if he wasn't listening to him, why did he go there? It's a long trip in those days. You didn't get on a plane and zip there. So why did he go listen to him?
Resurrection apologists in particular always present Galatians 1-2 as if it's their friend. When they read it, they see Paul making a pilgrimage to learn all about Jesus from the eyewitnesses. They all told stories and laughed and hugged and left on the same page. But when I read these chapters, I see nothing but hostility between Paul and the men who knew Jesus. Our interpretations are so vastly different, I was starting to feel gaslit.
He makes me feel like I'm the crazy one.
Despite reassurances from Bart Ehrman that I'm seeing things correctly.
In my judgment, he did not go to consult with Peter about the historical Jesus. He went there because he wanted apostolic support for his mission to the Gentiles. Peter was the head of the church in Jerusalem. Paul was converting Gentiles and telling them they didn't have to become Jewish. He knew that there were other people, especially the leadership in Jerusalem, that disagreed with him, and he went in order to work that out with them so that they would support his mission. And so it wasn't about finding information about Jesus. So that's the first thing. I don't think he was sitting there taking notes from Peter about it.
I've recently started reading Galatians commentaries, exclusively from Christian scholars, in preparation for this chapter in the book I'm working on. So Gary asks, why did Paul go? For scholars, the key issue is what Paul meant when he said he went to visit Cephas, in Greek, hysteresis kaphon. Christian scholars like F. Bruce, James Dunn, and others have extensively debated this verb hystereo. While it can mean to inquire information from, when used with a personal object, as here, it more commonly means simply to get acquainted with or to visit. As Christopher Tuckett notes, choosing the inquiry meaning would actually contradict Paul's entire argument in this passage, that he wasn't dependent on human instruction for his gospel. Paul's argument throughout Galatians 1 and 2 is precisely that his gospel came through direct revelation from Christ, not from the Jerusalem apostles. As Douglas Moo observes, Paul is responding to charges that he was dependent on and subordinate to the apostles at Jerusalem. The structure of his defense shows he's minimizing, not emphasizing, any learning from them. Consider the details Paul emphasizes. He waited 3 whole years before going to Jerusalem, stayed only 15 days, and saw only Peter and James. Paul even backs this with a solemn oath, hardly necessary if he was proudly describing theological education. The travel argument Gary makes actually supports Paul's point. As Martinus de Boer notes, Paul is showing his independence from Jerusalem. If he truly needed their instruction, why wait 3 years for such a long journey? Paul explicitly states his purpose for the second visit in Galatians 2:2, to present his gospel to ensure he wasn't running in vain. This wasn't about learning content, but about securing recognition and unity for his mission. As Craig Keener and others observe, Paul was seeking acknowledgement of the fundamental unity of their distinct missions. The scholarly consensus, reflected in commentaries by Bruce, Dunn, Longnecker, and others, is that Paul's visits were about establishing fellowship and gaining recognition for his independent mission, not about receiving theological instruction. Gary's interpretation actually undermines Paul's central argument for his apostolic independence.
And the first part of that is it required that we see Paul, the mature gospel message. No, I don't think that's true either, because in Galatians chapter 2, Paul lays the gospel, he says, I laid out the gospel message I was preaching, and they agreed with me. To me, what I see is Peter, James, the brother of Jesus. By the way, John is in Galatians 2, the second trip. And Paul, the 4 biggest names in Christian history, they all agreed on the nature of the gospel. So I can't see anybody was preaching the true gospel and the other ones weren't. I don't see that at all in the text.
Gary's new claim is that Paul laid out the gospel message, and they agreed with me, somehow proves universal gospel agreement. But this actually reinforces my original point about Gary misreading Paul's argument. The scholars agree that Paul's purpose was not to demonstrate agreement on content, but seeking affirmation for his Gentile mission. Gary's phrase, they all agreed on the nature of the gospel, misses what Paul meant by the truth of the gospel in this context. According to commentators, this specifically refers to Gentile freedom, the principle that Gentiles don't need circumcision to be saved. This agreement wasn't about resurrection content, but legitimizing Paul's non-Jewish theology. According to Craig Keener, Paul strategically wanted to show that the Jerusalem apostles recognized Paul as being genuinely called and equipped by God to bring the gospel to the nations, but they neither taught him what the gospel was, nor corrected his perception of it. So Gary's interpretation, that this proves everyone preached the same gospel, actually contradicts Paul's rhetorical purpose, which was to establish his independence while securing recognition and finances for his Gentile ministry. Gary is making these chapters about resurrection when the experts affirm my lifelong understanding in plain reading that they are not. Anyone following my regular assault on Gary's minimal facts knows that I have a problem with the specific phrasing of his second and third facts. Gary says, the disciples had experiences, which is ambiguous. Does the disciples mean all the disciples, or does it mean some of the disciples? For Gary, it's both. Since skeptical scholars affirm some disciples, he can affirm skeptical scholars affirm some disciples, and then when he's out preaching, he can let the congregation assume that the disciples means all 12, when it does not. I changed the word the to some in Facts 2 and 3 to avoid any mistaken impression that Gary's scholars defend that all of the disciples reported experiences. Gary's books themselves defend only some disciples, so I prefer the disambiguation for precision.
So many of the scholars admit that the disciples believed Jesus had risen from the dead. The disciples believed it.
It's virtually unanimous. It's going to be, I don't put percentage. People think I put percentages on the minimal facts. I don't, but I would think high 90s of critical scholars. Bart Ehrman doesn't hesitate to say the disciples believed Jesus was raised from the dead and believed that they saw him. And Martyrdom even says, why shouldn't I be willing to say this? It's a historical fact. He says that.
Yes. Bart affirms that some disciples believed that they saw him. He does not hold that all 12, or even most of the disciples, believed they personally saw a risen Jesus.
Some of the others, we don't know if all of the disciples even believed it. We don't know. We have all these stories, in the New Testament of the disciples doubting. Why do you have all these stories about them doubting? Why don't they just believe it? Well, probably because some of them doubted it. I think it's possible that not all 11 disciples came to believe that Jesus was raised from the dead based on their own experiences, but that they had heard from others that Jesus had been raised and they believed them.
Bart even did a course earlier this year called The Other Doubting Thomas. Did Jesus' disciples actually believe in the resurrection? And the second lecture covered Bart's reasons why some of Jesus' followers probably never believed in the resurrection. Be precise, Gary. Don't conflate and pretend you have the support where you don't. But of course, in other interviews, Gary seems to know this.
Okay, so is their explanation for why they believed it hallucinations? Is that the primary one?
Well, Bart Ehrman might disagree on this, but I think in earlier works, he leaned toward hallucination.
In Bart's 6-hour debate with Mike Licona on the resurrection, he explained his position.
You have these accounts abundantly attested that Paul saw Jesus, Peter saw Jesus, Mary, and I think probably these three people, I think you could say they saw something that they, as Mike said, that they interpreted as being Jesus. What about others? We don't have good accounts. Do you need supernatural interventions for somebody to have seen something that wasn't there? Mike called those hallucinations. I'm okay with hallucinations. I prefer to call them visions.
Virtually no skeptical scholar in a relevant field, almost none of them will ever say the disciples didn't believe in the resurrection. Bart Ehrman, who's probably the best-known skeptic in North America, one of the best-known ones in the world, He says in one of his books, he said, some, maybe all, of the apostles believed that Jesus was raised from the dead.
Bart affirms some. Again, stick to the facts.
They had experiences which they thought were risen appearances of Jesus. He said, am I afraid to say that? He said, I reject it, but I'm not afraid to say it because history shows it to be true. History shows it to be true. So I think they're not going to go after the 6 facts.
No, but we're going to go after your deliberately ambiguous wording because it allows for confusion. Change these to say some disciples, Gary. Not the disciples, some disciples. And while we're on the topic of not all the 12 were believers, Gary comes shockingly close to discussing the minimal witnesses hypothesis.
There aren't a lot of people who took this view, but there were a few major ones in the last few decades, since about 1970, who took the view that Peter had an experience. One very well-known skeptic says it could have been as simple as something he saw. He really could have seen something, or it could be as simple as an insight. Hey, I wonder if Jesus is alive. Man, this is really starting to click. He said he was going to be on the right hand of the Father. What if he is? If he's on the right hand of the Father and is who he claimed to be, pre-existent and the Son of God and all this, and he can forgive sin and rise from the dead, and whoever believes in him can rise from the dead, then I guess that when I thought I saw him the other day, it makes perfect sense that I saw him the other day. See, the guy said it could be as small as really seeing something that wasn't Jesus and thinking it was, or it could be as small as an insight.
Yes, exactly. The minimal witnesses hypothesis does not stand or fall on the nature of Peter's experience. A hallucination, an illusion, a delusion, an insight, or, as you just suggested, some kind of vision followed by a period of insight. Nailing down which it was makes no difference at all. These options merely show that there are plenty of ways that one person, like Peter, could have sincerely come to a belief that Jesus was risen in some sense. That's all we need. The focus is on how many, not how. Because the how possibilities are plentiful, and the evidence is underdeterminate, as we have no direct report from Peter of any kind.
Now the problem's there. I said, no, you're switching to squash or something. You're going to another game. You have another set of rules or no rules.
This seems to be Gary's analogy for not adhering to the argumentation categories that he has set up arbitrarily. What's the matter with saying that the cause of Peter's belief is unknown, but here's an array of plausible and compatible scenarios?
Here's one problem. Peter goes and tells the rest of them that, and I don't care if somebody's there like that who's like doubting Thomas or not. There are doubters in a group that you're going to come up with. There's going to be some guys that say, prove it. They're going to say, do you have some evidence for this? And if all they can say is, I don't need evidence. I was just thinking it makes sense for Jesus, who said he was the Son of God, to be at the right hand of God.
It's been estimated that there have been over 10 billion Christians in the past 200 years. Even if you think there were 600 eyewitnesses of risen Jesus, that means that more than 9,999,999,000 Christians came to believe in the resurrection due to testimony. Is Gary seriously complaining that while testimony was good enough and convincing for 9 billion people, that it couldn't possibly be convincing to 10 men who were already invested and emotionally charged and primed to want to continue the ministry? And by my hypothesis and Bart's affirmations, yeah, the historical data is consistent with almost all the disciples not believing this resurrection claim and disappearing from reliable history back into mundane lives of fishing or something. Probably most did reject it. But if just one or two joined Peter based on his testimony, just like the 9 billion Christians who followed, then everything is explained. What's implausible here? If people believing Peter was implausible, then a lot of stories in the book of Acts are just garbage.
And from there, all the guys start going, yeah, and they charge out in the world presenting the gospel.
Or just one of them does that.
And the three biggest named converters of the world, Paul, previous unbeliever, James, the brother of Jesus, previous unbeliever, and Peter, certainly a believer, but he denied his Lord 3 times. And these 3 guys are the guys who are the most sure that they've seen him, and they convinced the others. That's the way this particular theory works.
That's correct. All we need is Peter and James to believe him, or at least come on board. Paul had his own conversion thing that had nothing at all to do with what Peter or the 12 were saying, as we've already covered extensively here. The origin of Peter's belief is completely unrelated to Paul's conversion by Paul's own words.
It's not a hallucination theory, but it's closely related. And they convince all of them that it's true. Here's the problem. Those 3 guys, Paul, Peter, and James, according to first century sources, all die as martyrs.
That's not a problem at all. That would just put Paul and James into the category of people like the 9/11 hijackers who died for a belief they can't personally attest to. This is only a problem if you posit that Paul and James were knowingly lying. But if James believed Peter, then he's a Christian for the same reason Gary's a Christian, and his death is no different than if Gary were to face a similar end.
Now, I know it's true that we cannot prove that all the disciples died as martyrs. But here's the 3 big guys, the 3 guys that the whole church hangs on. Peter, Paul, and James, the brother of Jesus. They died for their faith. They didn't question it, as far as we know.
Yes, again, this isn't a problem. In this hypothesis, Peter, Paul, and James were all sincerely convinced.
How do we know they didn't question it? How do you know they didn't fall away later? Okay, time out. I've got a source for my view. What do you have as a source for your recanting?
I'm not positing recanting. What are you talking about? Why did you add recanting in here? All the flavors of minimal witnesses allow for Peter, Paul, and James to die while believing. The bigger problem is that none of these 3 would even have a chance to recant, since all 3 were political murderers. The killers didn't care one bit about what they professed. Ananus wanted James's job and influence, while Nero wanted to blame Christians for a fire. This is weak stuff you're peddling, Gary.
Well, I don't have a source. I just said what if. Okay, then if you can't show your view is true, don't take off on my evidence by your lack of evidence. See, at every step of this, there are claims to have data. And when someone says put up or shut up, there's no real data there.
Again, what are you talking about? The stories in the Gospels are also claims. They're older claims, They're in written form, and they were popular enough that thousands of people took time to copy them so that they could still exist. But that doesn't make them evidence. They're still just claims. They're not data.
But there's no data.
1,600 years ago, Augustine, he lived 354 to 430. He said, and I just came across this nugget talking about the perennial doubter. He said, what then can I adduce to convince those who refuse to believe? They refuse to believe these facts, in other words, the gospel, unless we can show them or prove by ocular demonstration or adequate testimony. Okay, ocular demonstration. Show me something I can see. Give me adequate testimony. But when we do, they say, not that, not that.
I'm sorry. What exactly was 4th century Augustine showing people to demonstrate the resurrection for their own eyes? What was this ocular demonstration he was giving? And can you show it to me now? No one's ever offered me something to see, and I hate to break it to you, but you definitionally weren't offering adequate testimony if the listener didn't become convinced. It's right in the name. The testimony was inadequate. Maybe it was adequate for you to believe, but what's actually convincing is in the ear of the beholder. Now, it's my contention that testimony alone is never sufficient to establish a miracle. It's always more likely that a person is lying or sincerely mistaken, so I'd work a little more on those ocular demonstrations. I'm looking forward to that.
So if you're one of those rare people, really rare, who can be solved by ocular experiences and you lost somebody close to you, tell that person you could be with them someday.
Hang tight. We've got to take a break. More on the American Family Radio Network with our very special guest, Dr. Gary Habermas. Stay tuned.
Oops. Sorry, Gary. We don't have time for your little advice to grieving people. They can wait. American Family Radio has bills to pay. Spoiler, this was not revisited after the commercial break.
I got to ask you this, Gary, because I was struck in reading through Volume 3. Again, Volume 3 on the Resurrection Scholarly Perspective. So you're just reading in alphabetical order what these scholars think on certain topics related to the resurrection. And I couldn't believe how many of them were saying that they believed that Jesus was a miracle worker. So my question is, since they don't believe in miracles, what do they think he was doing?
Okay. That's a great question. A little bit of explanation. One critical scholar, one of these guys way to the left, doesn't believe in miracles, but he says this. He says, to my knowledge, the entire critical community believe that, and they don't usually say the words miracle worker. They usually say healer. Jesus was a healer and an exorcist.
Well, that's a huge claim. That's big enough that I'm going to have to get my copy of Volume 3 to see what he's talking about. All right. Here's the section on Jesus as miracle worker and exorcist. And here's the very first entry. Bealby and Eddy observe that virtually everyone today recognizes that Jesus was considered to be an exorcist and a worker of miracles. Well, of course, everyone concedes that Jesus was considered to be an exorcist and miracle worker. I agree he was considered to be one. That's vastly different than saying scholars believe he was a miracle worker. This is a very, very important distinction. I can go through each entry in this section. Dunn highlights that Jesus was widely regarded by his contemporaries as a miracle worker. Ehrman, Jesus was perceived as a miracle worker. Habermas, wait, are you citing your own positions? Okay. Anyhow, you get the point. Even Gary's careful paraphrasing can't hide that scholars agree on miracle belief, not on actual miracles. And now you're going to let Frank seem silly because he didn't notice this.
And you go, wait a minute, you don't believe in demons? And the guy goes, of course I don't. And what about healing? Yeah, I think Jesus did that. So this one scholar said that virtually 100% of critics on the far left believe he was a healer and an exorcist.
The closest I can find to Gary's paraphrase here is Blackburn comments on the near unanimity of a positive view on Jesus' exorcisms and healing miracles among contemporary scholars. Even Boltman acknowledged it. Blackburn notes that although unanimity rarely occurs in academia, that Jesus acted as an exorcist and healer can easily be described as the consensus of the modern period. More importantly, Gary's very next sentence is, yet the consensus appears to evaporate when moving to certain secondary issues. These secondary issues are, of course, were these actual supernatural events or natural phenomena given miraculous interpretation? Should they be understood as psychological healings, psychosomatic cures, or genuine divine interventions? How do we distinguish between what actually happened versus later legendary embellishment? You know me, and of course I just had to track down this essay in the footnotes. Here's what it actually says, as Blackburn quotes Bolton. The Christian community was convinced that Jesus had performed miracles and told a good many miracle stories about him. Most of the wonder tales contained in the Gospels are legendary. At least they have legendary embellishments. This is another case of Gary exaggerating and conflating.
So these guys really do think healing takes place. But on the demons, you go, you think he was an exorcist? Absolutely. Yeah, but you don't believe in demons. No, absolutely not. But you think Jesus was an exorcist? Yes. Would you explain that for me? Okay. And the critic would, guy way over on the left side, maybe Jesus, some I remember, would say, I don't believe in demons. Therefore, I don't think Jesus cast any of them out. But Jesus had tremendous influence on people like a psychiatrist or a psychologist might have today. And if they were bound by something that today we would call psychiatric, depression, anxiety, whatever, they could be healed after dealing with him, especially if they came back to him a few times, quote unquote, they had a few sessions with him. And he goes, I don't believe in demons, but here's the reason, here's the key. I think he healed. The guy would say, I think Jesus flat out healed like a counselor can heal today. But here's why I think he was an exorcist. There's no demons, and he never cast a demon out. However, examples like the ones reported in the Gospels, either the example itself or one like it is true. In other words, that's a sense in which he was an exorcist, that Jesus very much did things in the Gospels or just like the things in the Gospels. So in other words, those statements in the Gospels, even guys who don't think the Gospels are reliable, they think a lot of those exorcisms without the demon part, they think the scenario where the person was healed, they are true historical accounts. That's a sense in which they think he was an exorcist, or the sense in which they think he was a real healer. Like a counselor could be a healer.
Okay, well, this is a bit of a distinction without a difference as far as I'm concerned. This would be a debate among people who agree that the Gospels definitely contain legendary development, but aren't sure if these healing stories were completely invented or grew from a kernel of truth. All this tells us is that there's reasonable evidence that Jesus was regarded as a healer, and that some skeptics enjoy what-if speculations granting some fragments of historicity as an intellectual exercise. Now, since I'm already pulling from a dozen different videos from Gary's Volume 3 tour, I'm going to include one segment from a response to his interview with Sean from friend of the channel, James Hodor. His live streams routinely contain amazing insights and are criminally underwatched, probably because they are many, many hours long and happen at strange times.
Someone's asked why you didn't address the cognitive dissonance theory in your second volume, where you specifically have naturalistic hypotheses. In the third volume, you address it in a different way, how other scholars respond to it. So you do address cognitive dissonance, but more importantly, if you had 2 or 3 criticisms for that view, and maybe just clarify for people, what exactly is a cognitive dissonance naturalist hypothesis? And what are maybe a couple of reasons why you just don't find it compelling?
Yeah, that's one of the main reasons I didn't cover it in very much detail in Volume 2. And I will say that in Volume 3, I've got pro and con scholars. Most scholars don't like it. It's not a very popular theory. Somebody throws it in when they can't make the swoon theory work or they can't make hallucinations work. They throw it in like, I got my fingers crossed that you haven't heard this one before. I don't consider it a major theory. Here's a little definition. Cognitive dissonance can be true. I don't know anybody who argues it can't be the case, but it doesn't describe the resurrection. Cognitive dissonance is a view that is often applied to the Seventh-day Adventists or the Jehovah's Witnesses or groups like that who made prophecies. The famous one was 1844 for the Seventh-day Adventists, and they sold their goods, wait for Jesus to return, and he didn't come, but they sold their homes.
This is called the Great Disappointment, 1844.
Sold everything. And what happened when Jesus did return? Almost always the move will be, we refigured the numbers. It's next month, so you go and do it next month. And he still doesn't return. So we would think these people would turn and walk away, right? Well, many of them did. But cognitive dissonance says, no, some of them bore down and got even more radical. In most of those cases, dissonance theory says that many of these people returned to the faith with a new interpretation and a greater depth of faith. Maybe the disciples were pretty good believers before Jesus died, but then Jesus died and they were hiding for fear of the Jews. So they're in a bad state, despair, depression, everything. But then out of the ashes, somebody breaks forth with this, maybe he's alive in heaven, like Jesus took his blood into the Holy of Holies. And when the disciples went out, and you're the guy that wrote the book on how many of them were martyred. And of course, we know that for the big 3, Paul, and James, the brother of Jesus, and Peter, we have first century references.
Paul wasn't a disciple of Jesus, despite what the apologists will somehow keep telling you, that somehow he counts in all of these numbers. Paul didn't know Jesus while he was alive and only came to Christianity several years later, so he's not really relevant to these discussions. But anyway, so Gary's done an all right job at explaining cognitive dissonance. The idea is that when there is an event that contradicts a deeply held belief that they've had, that introduces a state called cognitive dissonance, where there are these two ideas that stand in tension, and people don't like it when that happens, and so they try to resolve the dissonance. One method to do that, which has been documented many times, is to essentially find an explanation within their worldview that accounts for why the failed prophecy or the event contrary to what they'd expected. One method by which this often occurs that I discuss in my book, Unreasonable Faith, is a spiritualization, where an event that was initially supposed to be physical, observable, and public, like the return of Jesus, is reinterpreted to be something spiritual and not observable. Now, in my view, this perfectly describes what happens in the case of Jesus. Jesus was thought by his disciples to be the Jewish Messiah, whose role, as described in the Old Testament, was to overthrow the Romans, free Israel, and restore the kingdom. That was supposed to be a very public and verifiable event. None of those things happened. Instead, Jesus was killed by the Romans. His followers, at least some of them, reinterpreted what the Messiah would do, at least in the first coming. So they invented this idea of a second coming when all those things will happen as described in the Old Testament. But the first coming, those things kind of did happen as well. He did restore the kingdom, so to speak, but it was the kingdom of God, right? My kingdom is not of this world, sort of thing. So it was a spiritualization and reinterpretation. So I think cognitive dissonance theory very well accounts for what happened in the aftermath of Jesus' death. Now, it doesn't account for everything. Cognitive dissonance by itself doesn't explain where the accounts of Jesus' appearances come from. Cognitive dissonance doesn't directly lead to that. You need to invoke further hypotheses like hallucinations or memory contamination, as I do in my book, where I say that a number of these mechanisms alongside each other can account for the facts surrounding the early Jesus movement. This is a point that apologists somehow just ignore. They're happy to help themselves to cumulative cases. Apparently, the skeptic can't appeal to multiple mechanisms at once. It has to be either hallucinations, someone stealing the body, or cognitive dissonance, or memory distortions. It can't actually be all of these things at once, which I think is the more plausible explanation, because we know that all of these things happen, and all we have to suppose is that they happened in the same context, often triggered by one another.
Martyrdoms of all three, and you defend some qualified comments on the others. So it's a little bit hard. I think cognitive dissonance just doesn't happen. If you're going to make it a side category and you're going to say, oh, this big theory that explains everything can do it, and we know what those would be, elegant hallucination, whatever, so on. And then you want to say, oh, in sub-argument, in dissonance, sometimes people get more excited, so that would maybe help us understand their transformations.
Cognitive dissonance doesn't have to do everything for you. It's one component. And I don't know who would be arguing that it accounts for everything. Maybe someone said that, but Gary hasn't named them. In general, I would say that's not very plausible. It's going to be a component.
With the Jesus Seminar, says either parts of it or the whole creed predate Paul's walk to Damascus. That's first 2 to 3 years. If that creed in 1 Corinthians 15 with the appearance of 500.
So how long does cognitive dissonance take, Gary? 2 to 3 years? I think that's enough time. Do we have evidence that it needs to take a certain amount of time? I'm not aware of that.
But dissonance by itself, I don't think it's going to get us to first base. I just don't think it's a good theory. Just because some people go back off the mountain and are more dedicated to their faith doesn't mean their faith is true.
We don't know what proportion of Jesus' followers continued with him afterwards. We don't even know whether all of the apostles did. We only have good evidence for a handful. I think Sean has said Paul wasn't an apostle, so don't count him. It's just Peter and James who actually have good evidence that were martyred. We know almost nothing about most of the rest of them. But even if you think that all of the 12 stayed as followers of Jesus, you don't know about the rest of his followers. So what exactly are we arguing here? It has to be a certain proportion in order for the cognitive dissonance to apply. No one said that it's going to apply to everyone. The point is that it applies to some people, and exactly how many it applies to is going to depend on the details of the situation.
Faith was so deep by comparison. The minimal facts are all firm.
Gary, the cognitive dissonance theory would be part of a theory that accounts for the minimal facts. Like, it would account for why there are accounts of resurrection appearances, empty tomb maybe, and belief in the resurrection. Like, cognitive dissonance would be why we saw these. The idea there would be that there's initial belief in the resurrection, which then triggered appearances. My theory actually says it's the opposite, that the belief in the resurrection came after appearances in empty tomb led to a belief in the resurrection. But I think it's actually plausible that it could have gone the other way around as well. But the point is, either of these accounts are going to account for why we have reports of the appearances and the belief in the empty tomb and the belief in the resurrection. So Gary just saying the minimal facts hold firm, it's just a complete red herring.
And of course, a couple of the known facts that would be a particular problem, even if you've got the disciples, would be what cognitive dissonance did Paul have? What cognitive dissonance did James have?
This is a straw man arguing that the person advocating for cognitive dissonance needs to apply that in every case, which they don't need to. We don't have any good evidence that James was a skeptic who converted because of an appearance. This is something I consistently argue for, despite apologists consistently lying about this. Even if you take the New Testament at face value, it just says that there was a time when he was not a believer and the time when he was later a believer, and he had an experience. It doesn't say that he converted because of the experience. It just says that he had one. At some point, he wasn't a follower, and later he was. To say that he converted because of the experience is just post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. Now, as for Paul, Paul's experience is not explained by the resurrection. I don't understand how apologists have missed this point. It's a totally different thing. Now, I'm not saying that the Christian can't explain it. What I'm saying is they need to invoke additional hypotheses to account for it. It's also not accounted for by the resurrection. It's only accounted for by additional hypotheses about what Jesus did following the resurrection. I don't understand how I seem to be the first person making this point. It seems like I never hear this discussed. And it really irritates me that Christians, the apologists, keep adding in Paul's experience as if it supports the resurrection when it has nothing to do with the resurrection. These things can all fit together very nicely if, again, you think about it for more than 5 seconds. But the apologists here are not honest about this. They just want to bat away any possible skeptical hypothesis. And so they straw man any hypothesis by saying it has to account for everything, as if, because the stolen body, that can't account for everything. We reject that. Hallucinations can't account for everything, so we reject that. Cognitive dissonance can't account for everything, so we reject that. Legendary developments or memory biases can't account for everything, so we reject that. In fact, all of these things need to be considered together to provide a plausible explanation in different combinations and varieties, depending on what you're trying to explain. The apologists wouldn't accept this sort of criticism of any of their arguments. They were always on about cumulative cases and looking at things in context and comparing different passages and so forth. But somehow when the skeptic advocates a hypothesis, that doesn't account for everything, so we can just ignore it.
The empty tomb, at best, the origin of the Christian way. I think you're right. There are examples historically of cognitive dissonance and people sticking with the belief when proven wrong.
It explains far too little. Yes, there are some cases, but it explains far too little. It doesn't get to first base with the minimal facts.
What does it mean, get to first base? What does he mean by that? Gary uses metaphors like this sometimes, and I don't understand what he's saying. What is first base with the minimal facts? What would it take to get there? All he said is it doesn't account for everything. It's not supposed to account for everything. It can account for some things.
If you haven't already, subscribe to James's channel.
Perhaps that's enough. That's enough Gary Habermas for anyone for the time being.
I agree. Let's wrap this up with one last segment.
I think the world, Frank, is full of people who think Christianity looks good. There's some evidences for it. And we often ask about atheists. Frank, you know this as well as anybody. I'm not trying to put anybody down, but darn it, talking to atheists and other strong, especially Jesus mythers, they are frequently very angry and they go off. I think a lot of that emotion is because they're confronted with data that they frankly don't have for their worldview, and they don't like being pushed. And when you push, the more you push, the angrier they get. I think that's what spawns the emotions.
I leave it as homework for the viewer to go through my Paulogia versus Gary Habermas playlist and let me know which of us gets angry and emotional.
And Frank, I think that's why most people who, if they walk away, if they say, I don't, those who say I do come to Jesus. Those who say I don't, I think they oftentimes, I know this because they've told me, Tony Flew on theism, they say, I've been playing with this for a long time, and I think the data are pretty good, but I didn't want to go there. It didn't fit my lifestyle. It doesn't fit my friends that I hang around with. It doesn't fit my blah, 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 blah. And they're saying no.
That doesn't follow for me, Gary, nor nearly any evangelical I've ever spoken to. I was a committed Christian of many decades before I started investigating the resurrection in detail. And I investigated it not to prove it wrong. I was investigating to prove it right. All my friends, family, and colleagues at the time were believing Christians. By all external measures, I was bearing the fruit of the Spirit. My lifestyle was that of an evangelical, avoiding all the big sins. And if I'd have wanted to sin, I'd have stuck to Christianity where I could be forgiven. This is all part of othering those who don't come to your conclusion, so that you can represent to your audience that you have this amazing case. If that's true, why do you think that in the 14 years you've been writing this book, so many people have left the faith because of a lack of evidence?
And the more you push, the angrier they get. So yeah, they say, I don't. But Jesus requires it. And the other side, as I'm sure you say over and over again, and your atheists don't have enough faith to be an atheist book, they want to say, I do to me. didn't want to say I do to their spouse or to the Lord.
I'd have very happily stayed and let Jesus be my Lord if I had sufficient reason to believe he is alive. I'd even very happily come back to Christianity if I could become convinced. Not only would this heal many of the strained relationships in my life with the people I love most, but I guarantee that my YouTube channel would explode with Christian support. As one of the lost sheep who came home, you'd probably even have me on your channel, Gary. It's not that I don't want the resurrection to be true. It's just that I don't find it to be true. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoy what we do here, please subscribe to the channel. And if you're willing and able, please consider supporting us through membership or on Patreon so I can keep making content like this. For more of this former Christian taking a look at the claims of Christians, tap on the thumbnail on screen now, and I'll see you over there. Until next time, later.